Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on optimizing AWS organizations. I'm James Casagrande. I'm from Sunray Security, and I'll be your moderator today. This is part one of a series we're going to do on AWS organizations. Today's focus is going to be on the thing that trips people up the most when they're trying to refactor their AWS orgs, and we think is the most important to get fixed first, is audit. Audit, org trail, setting up the right CloudTrails, and everything to do with that and not having any audit gaps. Sunray Security, if you don't know us, we are obsessed with securing identity and permissions in the cloud. We have a ton of experience around this, both in AWS, Azure, and GCP. But today is all about AWS. And joining me today as our main speakers is our co-founder from Sunray, Sandy Bird, who is, you might know him from QRadar and from IBM Security, but he co-founded Sunray a number of years ago. And joining him as well is Christoph from Cyber, who co-founded the awesome AWS learning company Cyber, which you as an attendee of this webinar have received a free month's access to. We'll be referring to a few Cyber courses in here that you should kind of take as a next step in some of these actions, is setting up org trails and whatnot. So thanks so much for Christoph for offering that free month for everybody here today. Real quick, I think the next slide, we go over sort of just what we think the outline is going to be of this series. It's really about, you've got an AWS organization and you need to figure out how to redo it, or for whatever reason, which Sandy will go over in a second. But today we'll do audit. Next time we'll talk about restructuring sort of the hierarchy, organizational units. Then we'll get into policies, SCPs and RCPs, service control policies, our favorite thing here at Sunray. Then we'll talk about delegated admin and some IAM stuff. But if you have topics that you're concerned about, that you want to dive into with AWS organizations, please let us know, and we'll take it into consideration. We might just say, you know what, that's a great idea, and we'll make it part of the series. There will be time for questions at the end. We will send you a link again if you to Christoph's course and your free month of Cyber if you haven't seen it already. It should be in your inbox. But that's pretty much it. Without further ado, I want to pass it over to Sandy. Good morning, Sandy, and how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, James, and welcome, Christoph, for joining me again, and for giving all these guys access to a little bit of your coursework to help them out with this topic. This is an interesting one. If you're new to AWS organizations, this is a very applicable topic because you probably haven't set a lot of this stuff up yet. However, most of our kind of customers in the early days, are on Cloud 2.0 or 3.0. They've rebuilt it several times, and this is on their second time going through organizations, and it's still not set up right sometimes. And so you end up with this world where you've got to get to the point that you set some of these processes up, like an organization trail. This kind of gives us a prescriptive way to go through and do that, and has a couple other hints as we go along the path. So Christoph and I will take you through that today. We're going to show you more process today than the actual underlying details, because the details are in the coursework. So if you actually want to go and do this, you should take the courses and go through that. But let's kind of walk through this. As James said, this is part one of a many-part series. We know there's at least 4 parts here, but there's probably more. If you have areas you want us to spend time in, just let us know what those are. Again, this course mostly will be for people that are, using AWS organizations today. If you've never seen AWS organizations before, you may want to go and do some early work on that. We're going to talk about it like you at least know what it is from those sides. And it's most of the things we're talking about are companies that have multiple teams working under the person that owns AWS organizations. If you're, a 20-person shop and everybody does everything in AWS, and you've got 10 accounts and everyone knows what everybody does, you can probably figure this out almost on your own in that scenario. But if you're, running, cloud infrastructure for a fairly large enterprise, and you have 10 or 15 disparate groups working under you, building different things, sometimes moving the way that you do things becomes very hard. And if you have 500 accounts or 1,000 accounts, it becomes really hard to coordinate all of that. And so this is a process you can go through to get centralized CloudTrail set up from one of those messy worlds that you may live in on that side. And so we're going to talk through that kind of as we go here. There's a lot of reasons you end up kind of in this mess where you want to get to a better AWS Organizations, but there's reasons why you can't get there. And I can't tell you how many customers we work with that are on, I don't know, their third iteration or their fourth iteration of rebuilding their whole AWS infrastructure because it's going to be better the next time we do it. And often what happens is they still have AWS 1.0 running because there's some workload in there they somehow can't migrate to the next version, and it's still kicking around in that old org. And they need to find a way to finally get that original AWS organization up to whatever the minimum best practices are that they want. If other customers where they acquire other companies, they have to merge those with their AWS organizations, and that causes all kinds of interesting grief as you're trying to take accounts that maybe have their own CloudTrails running in them. Now you're getting your org trail in there, and you've got double billing going on and all kinds of weird stuff there. I really get scared when we see workloads still running in org accounts. Christoph, I don't know how often you run into this with people that you talk to, but we often find customers that they started in one account, they then took that account and made that their org account, then they added a bunch of other accounts underneath of it. And then, of course, what happens is trying to get those workloads out of the org account becomes problematic. And so that's always an issue. And there's all kinds of other things. Billing gets in the way, et cetera. And so at some point in time, you need to actually start implementing some of this stuff and doing it. And you can't do it overnight as much as some people try. You need to have a little bit of planning and process to get through this. And so my hope is that we're going to do this webinar. We're going to give you access to some great course material with great details in it. But this becomes an asset that we can use as a company where when we're interacting with a customer that's not done this yet, we can point them to this and say, here's a great process for working through. Christoph, anything else you would mention kind of in how people get into this mess before we start talking about how to get them out of the mess?
Yeah, and to be fair, it's easy to do that, especially if you've been running in AWS for the past, say, decade, right? Because if you started, say, 10 years ago, some of those best practices have changed since then. They've launched new services. IAM and IAM users and groups used to be king. We didn't really used to have Identity Center back then. And then now they're trying to push everybody to use Identity Center because it has so many more benefits. But if you've got everything baked in with IAM users and groups, it's going to be really hard to transition over to Identity Center. So I see on there you have half-baked Identity Center implementations. That's just one example that also translates to AWS Organizations, and they've launched new features for that. They've launched new services and new support. But it's where we are today is definitely not where AWS was 10 years ago. So even if you were doing everything perfectly right 10 years ago, now you are no longer necessarily following all the best practices. So it's very easy to get in that situation, and I've seen it time and time again. I've also worked through it myself. And I'd be lying if I said that my AWS environments right now are 100% perfect. There are definitely still some things that I would have to migrate over or merge over. And sometimes it's just not top priority. You need to launch new features. You don't necessarily have time to go back and make some of those important changes. But as you'll see in this presentation, while it can be tough, while you can break things if you're not doing it correctly, there is a good structure, there is a good flow that you can follow in order to properly deploy AWS Organizations and an org-wide CloudTrail so that you can then properly audit and get rid of all the individual trails you have in all of your different accounts. So hopefully that's what we can help you and walk away with at the end of this presentation.
Sounds good. Look, I just threw this slide in here just to talk about what happens when you do it wrong. And there's kind of two conflicts that happen to a lot of companies, and we see both of these. And the bigger the companies get, the kind of changes. In smaller companies, you usually end up with what I'll call, this conflict A. There's rather too many people with access to the org account. Like every developer has access to it, and they can go in and make changes to Identity Center or something. At that point in time, it's the Wild West because anyone can break any rules that they want. You can't even control what happens because if you're in the organization account, you pretty much can get access to any account and change any rule that you want. And so, you really need to kick those people out of there. The inverse of that, though, becomes we often see there are so many rules around the organization account and people are so scared of it. The amount of process to get in and make a change becomes an impediment to moving forward. And so you end up with this weird conflict. You need to have enough access and enough people that can do the right things in there that are skilled, because you don't want them breaking your workloads, versus, just being in a stalemate thing. That's one thing you have to sort out. What is the right balance on that? And AWS has this great feature, which we'll talk about in a later session, called delegated admin, where you can move the use of some of the organization features to another account, which is not the organization account. It's a super powerful way to kind of grit a nice separation of duties in that scenario. The other one, conflict B, is interesting too. And this happens as your accounts grow and you have more and more kind of disparate workloads underneath of them, and you're trying to write things like SCPs. One of two things happens. Security ends up suffering because you're trying to make everyone happy. You have that one team that for some reason wants to, and we'll use CloudTrail as the example, they want to run their own, they want to change the configuration of it from time to time. And because of that, you can't put a centralized CloudTrail rule at the top that says nobody can turn off CloudTrails or change CloudTrails. And so you end up with a scenario where you can't get the right security there. The other scenario is, you try to put things in and you end up breaking workloads. Like, oh, I'd like to enforce SSL encryption everywhere. And you put that in and you find out there's some team down below that's still using some old thing that doesn't work properly with encryption, and it breaks their workload. And so you end up with this other conflict where you can't do anything and make any serious changes because of that. I don't know, Christoph, you have other kind of balance of trade conflicts that you see sometimes in organizations that cause rather too many people or too little people to have the right access.
I love that you provided the SSL encryption example, because a friend of mine recently went through that exact scenario where he was brought on as a contractor for a team, and they wanted him to fix some things for an audit. And he goes in, he's like, I think I could probably pass in this bucket policy or whatever it was to block non-encrypted communications with this bucket, or again, whatever it was. But just to be safe, let's go ahead and audit the trails and make sure there's no requests coming through that are using some legacy code or whatever. And sure enough, there was something that was using legacy code. And so if they had implemented an SCP or CP or whatever, that would have blocked some of that, then it would have potentially caused not a major outage, but would have caused some sort of issue for some team. So you never know, and you need to be able to have visibility into your environment. And if you're not setting up AWS Organizations and CloudTrail properly, then you can't really, or at least you can't easily get access to that data. You may have lapses in data. You just can't properly audit. So that would be the other thing I would add to that.
Absolutely. It's I actually remember that SSL one. There's probably 7 years ago or something when we, made that change here where we put it in an SCP where it was required everywhere or something. And you always find some crazy legacy process somewhere that you didn't remember you had. And it, once you get it in and it's controlled, it's great. But until that point, you got to do a lot of testing before you turn these things off. There's some interesting best practices and around organizations just generally. AWS wants you to have a multi-account strategy, and it's the right thing to do. It's actually one of the most powerful things in cloud. By separating the environments, development versus production, separating the different types of workloads you're building, an AI workload versus some back-end HR process, and giving teams their own playgrounds. Like if you can separate all those things out into multiple accounts, you just have this great place where if something goes wrong, you can clean it up really quickly. I always think of the sandbox account that, you're letting people play and they make a mistake. You accidentally end up with a crypto miner in there somehow. It's a terrible day, whatever it is. If that's a sandbox account, you can just burn that thing to the ground and move on, right? Sure, you got to collect some audit data and you got to do some cleanup and all the things, but the reality is there's nothing you need to worry about. And then in a production environment with really sensitive data, you can wrap that thing in beautiful controls that just lock the thing down so that you hopefully never, ever have to deal with the fact there's a crypto miner running in there. And so AWS has given us this ability and also made it such that the accounts don't interact really with each other at all, unless you want them to, in which case you can configure them to do that. So again, that's why you want to get, first of all, your workloads out of that org account, right? That's the first step in getting this multi-account strategy doing. The other thing, and this is where, again, people have different opinions of how all this stuff works. Christoph, super interested in your opinions on this one, but I'll talk through mine first. The OU design, so the hierarchy you're going to put into your world, I always say you need to figure out what your security rules are that you're going to do, and then you build your OU structure to mimic where you're going to put the security rules. Now, for most companies, that is things like production versus development versus sandbox. And you can say in production, we're going to have these rules, and in sandboxes, we're going to have different rules. And if they're in different parts of the OU tree, it's a perfect spot to deploy those policies. But that may not work for some organizations. Like, if you have workloads running in Europe versus Asia versus North America, you may have very different rules based on location, in which case maybe location becomes what you want for that OU structure. And you only get 5 levels of depth. I think I'm right on that, Christoph. I spent a lot of time in GCP lately, which is different, but I'm pretty sure in AWS it's 5 levels. You have to kind of plan that out because you only get those 5 levels. You can't keep adding tiers underneath of it. So again, I think there's a lot of planning that should be put into that. We could probably do another course on OU design at some point in time. All right, thoughts on that one, Christoph, just on OU design before we kind of move on to CloudTrail?
Usually what I'll recommend is, if you're not familiar with it, AWS has their SRA, or Security Reference Architecture, and there's also the Control Tower service, and I bring those two up because they differ a little bit. And the SRA in particular, if you go and look up their I don't know if they call it a white paper or they've kind of transitioned some of that, but it's basically in their documentation. It looks like documentation. If you go in there, they give you guidance on how you can structure your organizational units and what you might want to put in them in terms of services, in terms of workloads. I usually recommend starting with that in mind, but making sure that you don't look at that and go, this is exactly how I have to deploy this. It's more so of, here's what we recommend if you have these sorts of workloads, or if you need to deploy XYZ, here's where you might want to deploy your security tooling, your log archive account, and then here's where you might want to deploy your VPC resources so they can be shared with your workloads. Like, that's a great starting point. And then you can cross-reference that with Control Tower, which might do it just a little bit different, but still very similar to the SRA. And then you can look at your own organizational structure, internal structure, development structure, et cetera, and you can kind of see where that makes sense and where you might have to tweak it. But at least you're not just starting from 0 point of reference. You have something you can compare to that's been vetted by AWS themselves. And typically I've seen that be very helpful for folks that don't really know where to get started.
It's, again, great examples. And I think, so we had a previous webinar we did, James has put a link in here, that was about maximizing space in that policy. So the great thing about the OU structures is that's where you're going to attach your SCPs and RCPs, basically the policies that you want everything below that point to abide by. And unfortunately, AWS is pretty tight on how much you're allowed to put in those policies. They can only be so big. And on top of that, you can only attach them like 4 at a point. And then on top of that, you can only have so many policies total in the whole organization. And so what happens is that you need to maximize the space usually that you can put in those. So we have some other links in there on how to do that. And I think, Christoph, in some of your coursework, you talk about that as well. So again, we can't cover that all today, but there's some good notes in there. There's a new thing that I've been kind of recommending to people that have really big organizations. So if you're above 500 accounts, a lot of people go to AWS and say, man, can you just increase the limits for the number of accounts that I can put in an org, because they want to get into the 10,000 and higher ranges or something crazy like that. I actually think you should start splitting orgs probably somewhere around the 500 account number, because if you want to maximize that policy space, you only have 2,000 policy documents. If you want to maximize it, you really could run into trouble somewhere in that range, 400 to 500 accounts. You're starting to bump up against the limits. You'll see that it says you can attach 5 policies. It's not quite true, because you need an allow policy, which most people would leave the full access policy there, so that chews up one of your entitlements. And maybe AWS will give us a gift someday and allow more policy attachments. But today, that's what the limits are. So at some point in time, you may want to think about splitting orgs just to get more space. Other things that organizations, you got to have centralized CloudTrail. That's what we're going to talk about today. Identity Center is super useful at getting humans into these accounts when you need them. It's actually what our Cloud Permissions Firewall uses to set up JIT. So if you want just-in-time access into AWS instantly, it uses Identity Center to do that. You've got centralized vending of accounts, your control tower, as Christoph mentioned, account factories, things like that. You have all this great work. And so you need best practice in all those. We're going to talk about CloudTrail today, but certainly it doesn't stop there. This is one of the most powerful things AWS gives you to manage these accounts. Just one quick note, and this happens to a lot of people if you're on, whatever your 10th year, as Christoph says, you often run into an OU structure, you run out of top SCP attachment points, or you don't like the way the structure is, and you need to add another level. And people get really scared by this. They almost get frozen. Like, we can't change this structure. We can't change the structure. You absolutely can change the structure all the time. And there's a simple process for adding new levels to it. This kind of just outlines it. All you have to do is at the top root level, add a brand new OU there with nothing underneath of it. Then basically reproduce your OU structure that you have under that new OU. Now you've created another level of depth. So if you think about basically your policy, you just doubled the amount of policy attachment space that you have. Once you get that, you just move the exact same policies that are attached at the existing OUs to the new OUs. And then once that's in place, you just move the accounts over, and the policies attached to the accounts will move with the accounts. Once that's done, you can delete the old OU structure, and now you have a new OU structure, and you didn't break anything in that process. And so it's pretty easy to go and actually kind of add levels to your OU structure. Say, that seems like a lot of work. It doesn't. You can ask any of these Gen AI models to build you a script to do this for you, and they literally will just give you a script that would do it. Obviously tested in a development OU or a development AWS organization first before you run some random AI code in your main org. But the fact is, it's a super simple process to actually do this, even if you have a large structure with 900 accounts in it. So anyway, quick way to gain more space there if you need some. So the big topic for today, let's figure out how to move your legacy logging into an org CloudTrail. And there's some massive benefits here. First of all, single trail for the whole organization is just way easier for compliance. All your log data is in one spot, gives you a spot to archive it. When a new account comes on board, which you'll often want to add new accounts, you don't have to do anything. Logging's already set up. It just happens. And the other thing, and this is really important, it's one of the things that people forget about when they initially set up logging and they put everything in the same account, which is a terrible idea to begin with, but they do it. If you were to delete the account or suspend the account, the audit data is gone. And by using this mechanism with a single CloudTrail going to a logging account, you'll be able to keep that data around. Lots of visibility. You gain some amazing ability to limit access to exactly parts of the log data through policies. Super cost effective. First one's free in the AWS world, so they kind of give you one CloudTrail for free, which is nice. And if an attacker happens to own an individual account, there's nothing they can do to your logs. So again, some great benefits just on moving to a centralized CloudTrail, and everyone should do it. It's best practice across the board. The way this gets implemented, it's done in the org account. It doesn't mean the logs have to stay in the org account. They should absolutely not. They should be put in a dedicated logging account somewhere outside the org. I would even basically suggest you just use that account for logging and nothing else. Some people put it in a security account or things like that, but I think it actually should just be a dedicated logging account. And we make sure that we use S3 bucket policies and KMS policies on that to really limit who gets access to those logs and who can write to the logs as well, although CloudTrail is going to be writing to all the logs to the policy, but that's pretty simple. Again, you should figure out what you need for security requirements. We would recommend things like, getting the tampering and the signing turned on, dealing with encryption and putting the right set of encryption and the right set of keys for it. However, everybody's going to be a little different in what they need for those. So when we go through these steps, we'll talk about, you need to do a little bit of an architectural design here to get the things that you need into that. And from there, you can then deploy it across the whole org. Christoph, and again, maybe you should talk through some of the stuff as well. Any thoughts in doing this without, annoying the teams and getting some additional costs before we get into the details of this process?
I think some of that will surface as we talk about the details of going through. Just to kind of add on to what you were saying about which account to store it in. And again, I think I'm getting ahead a little bit here, so I'll just surface level it. But if you are able to separate it and have just that log archive account, which is what the SRA and Control Tower both refer to it as, where you're just storing those logs, and then you can have that security tooling or audit account where you're running the tools that ingest that data for whatever purpose, whether that's for incident response, regular compliance checks, just anything that needs to look at the data in order to spit out some kind of result, that should actually be in a totally different account. And so that can result in some complications, which can end up annoying the teams if you're not setting it up properly, because it might limit their ability to do that unless you circumvent some of those issues. But I'm getting slightly ahead here, so I'll actually bring that back up as we get into some of the issues. I think in the prior slide you mentioned some security implications. There's also not just security implications, but some issues with certain services you might be using now that access that data that will end up breaking as you do this. So I'll be sure to bring that back up here as we talk about some of the issues with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you follow this kind of order of operations and some of the stuff that Christoph and I talk about through here, you really can avoid the annoying of the teams thing. Part of that's about just communication. There's no product in the world that can help you solve that. But if you communicate well as you do it, we can really kind of help not annoy these teams and give them back the data access that they need and they always had. You got to be careful around additional costs here. And I ran into this problem early playing with AWS where we actually had created a double CloudTrail for a month, and you would be amazed at how big the bill is at the end of the month when you accidentally do that and you have double the storage, double the CloudTrail, double the whatever. And especially if you're dealing with data events, you can really rack up a big bill. So you want to be careful here on the cost side of this thing. And you don't want to cause a gap in compliance. The last thing you want is some auditor finding out that, you did one thing and, you turned certain logs off before you get the other one turned on, and all of a sudden there's a hole in your audit data. You don't want that to happen. So if we do this in order, we should be in good shape. The first one actually starts out with, design what you're going to do. Don't enable it yet, but just, get down on paper what you're going to do in terms of where everything's going to go. Make sure you get your logging account stuff. We're going to go through each one of these in step. Then we're going to inventory what the teams have already done. So what's out there that you're replacing, so we can make sure that. We're going to communicate with the teams. Once we've communicated with the teams, we're going to set this organization trail up and turn the thing on. Once it's on, we're going to disable the old ones, get those turned off so we don't have the double billing. And then there's some optional things we can do if we wanted to merge the old data with the new and get additional kind of cost reductions there. So this is kind of the step process. We're going to go through each one of these steps quickly. We'll talk about each one. The designing of the centralized trail, we've kind of alluded to all this already. Dedicated logging account. Probably should add in here, Christoph, dedicated tools account for interacting with the data. Although depending, if you're in a really large company, you may not even want cross teams to have access to the central one that the security team looks through all the logs with, but you want to have access to just their logs out of the trail where they can run their own tools and their own accounts. That's absolutely possible, setting up these bucket policies and key policies. So you can design for that when you're setting it up. Please use a KMS key, because again, then we can put real policies on that KMS key. And that's really simple to set up using the CloudTrail UI when you go to do it. You got to figure out which configurations are important to you. Everybody needs a multi-region trail, even if you're only in one region, because accidentally somebody could stand something up in a different region. You got to choose if you want data events. This is one of my only examples where sometimes I suggest it's possible you should maybe have more than one CloudTrail, is that your centralized CloudTrail, you may choose not to put data events in it. For the people that aren't familiar, data events are things like S3 reads and writes, so get object and things like that. You may have billions of those calls happening in your account, and they're expensive to log and they're expensive to store. And from a compliance perspective, there may only be certain areas where you actually need that. You may choose to set your centralized CloudTrail up without the data events in it, and then have a special CloudTrail in that one account for those events where you need the data events. Again, there's multiple ways to set that up, but it's why doing a little bit of design up front, you can try to minimize that cost. You need versioning on, you choose these things wisely as you do them, but get them set up right the first time, and then you're good to go. Once you have the design and documented, I actually recommend you create the logging account, create the S3 bucket, create the key. so that when we talk to the teams later on, if they want to do some testing, like, can I actually read data out of this bucket based on how you set the bucket policy up? Does it work or not? And so now you can run some tests after that. Any other design considerations, Christoph, that we should talk about in here?
Well, in the design phase, I would absolutely recommend, if you don't already have this in your org documentation, going through and taking a look at what tools are actively gathering data from your current trails that are spread out. Document that so that you know what's going to need to be modified or that will break once you turn off those trails. Because you'll have some time, as you see here, you'll have some time between turning on the org trail and then removing the other ones. So it's not like you have to immediately turn everything off on the flip side of it. But if you don't know what's going to be impacted by turning off those trails as you move over to the org trail, then you're going to experience some issues. So as part of the design part as well, I would spend a few hours at least looking through and documenting everything that's currently ingesting that data across those different accounts.
Absolutely. And I think that's the exact, that's the next step, right? You get it. I actually even think before you turn it on, communicate what you're going to do with the teams and then audit those existing trails. And somehow I actually think you audit the trails programmatically first, get that list, then take that to the teams as you go to them and say, hey, we noticed you've had these 4 trails turned on. Is there any integrations that you're unaware of that we need to be aware of as we start to do this, kind of to your point, Christoph? And there's lots of ways to get this inventory. And most people will have a CSPM tool. If you're a fairly large enterprise, you probably already have a CSPM tool in place. And so you can just use that to grab the inventory of CloudTrails. They'll all have it in it. You can absolutely just script this out of the Cloud Shell in the org account and just say, use some script that basically assumes the organizational access role in every account. From there, describes the CloudTrails that are running there, describes the S3 bucket that they're in, describes the key that they're in. Again, if you need help with that, clearly any of these Gen AI things can generate that script in 4 seconds. Just give it a beautiful prompt. Or you can have the team self-report. If you have the team self-report, there's always the option that they're going to miss one. I prefer the programmatic method. That will give you the list. Once you have the list, now we have something to go talk to the teams about. When you do this, you want to capture a few things. The name of the trail and the prefix are important. The reason the prefix is important is if you choose later in this that you want to merge the old CloudTrail data and the new CloudTrail data into the same bucket, the centralized one you just created, you're going to need to know what these prefixes are so you can stitch them into the right places. And then if any tools are using that prefix, make sure that they can use it right. So you need to capture that stuff. You got to figure out where that data is, because again, if you're going to go to move that data later, the key, you're going to need encryption. So you need all that. It's also interesting to know what some of the trail settings are in the cases of the other trails that are there. So you want to capture that all kind of programmatically. Once you have that, now you can actually go and communicate that to the individual teams. Explain why you're making the changes. We gave you all the evidence on that first slide. Clear timeline as to when you want to do this. Don't, say it has to be done tomorrow. Give them a few weeks to get their ducks in an order or whatever they need to do on that side. Also, and I would recommend this, when you're done, you actually put an SCP in place that doesn't let people create more CloudTrails without some form of an approval process, because again, you want to avoid that double billing. So remind them that after this point and change, they won't be able to actually create new CloudTrails on their own without some sort of approval. Again, to Christoph's point, let's gather up any other requirements they have, integrations. They may be putting data in Datadog or Splunk or some other tool. Again, how are we going to do that? They need to move to this new bucket as well. Again, all the bucket policies and everything will allow us to put any access in there that we need and keep it locked down. And this is where, if you created the access count, the logging access account and the S3 bucket and got the policy set up on it, if one of the teams before this ever occurs wants to try, you can basically predict what the path is going to be based on the org ID and the account number and the things. And you could put a couple test files in there and have the team test if they can read those files properly with whatever tooling they're using, right? Maybe they're using Athena because they're using some AWS stuff. Maybe they've got the data going to Datadog. They want to make sure they can still read those files. You can put some test files in there, get them to read them before you ever make this change and say, yeah, we're going to be happy on the day of the changeover. We're going to be able to get this new data and this integration going. So maybe you've got to set up, SQS queues to actually tell them when the files arrive and things. You can get all that done before the day of the changeover. So anything else to communicate, Christoph, that I missed there?
I was going to say that's critical. That last part that you just mentioned is absolutely critical because you probably are going to get permissions wrong initially.
Yeah.
It just, there's always that one thing that you forget, you miss, and then it just doesn't work. You can't access it. And then it might take a while to troubleshoot it. Meanwhile, the team can't access it, and that could be frustrating. So definitely test that out. I love the example of just creating a test file, for example, or script and having it try it out. I was going to ask you though, Sandy, for creating, once you've enabled org trails and set up SCPs that prevent creating individual account trails, have you ever seen a use case, because I was trying to think of one and I can't think of one, where it still makes sense for some teams to have access to creating individual account trails because they can still access the data from the centralized location if it's set up properly?
Yeah.
So when would they, if ever, need to do that?
It really is the data events, or, you can actually have it logged, Lambda executions. There's a bunch of other kind of configuration you can choose to put in that centralized CloudTrail. And you as the centralized team may choose not to do some of that for cost reasons. That's the only reason I can think of. And again, we have that scenario here where in the production account, we kind of have different rules than we have everywhere else, right? And so you may choose in one of the accounts to allow for a CloudTrail with a different config, but it's usually like a super rare event. It's not something they're doing every day. It's like, no, in this production account, we need to have S3 data events or Lambda certain events for this one bucket or whatever it is. Okay, that's great. In that account, let's go set up a different CloudTrail. We do it that one time. And then once it, whatever, you could remove the SCP rule for the 10 minutes it takes to set it up and then just turn the SCP rule back on or something, right? You could do those types of things with it to do it, but it has to go through some approval process. It will be super rare after you do this. But there are, just due to cost reasons, there may be a scenario where you have to have a secondary CloudTrail somewhere capturing that additional event data that you don't want across your entire 900 accounts that are running.
Yeah, so that's a good point.
Yeah. Okay, so you've communicated. It's the day you're going to create the CloudTrail. And so this is the day the bill starts to happen, right? So you've incorporated any changes that the teams have. If they're, maybe you need to manipulate your CloudTrail a little bit or your architecture diagram. So you do that, you get that in place, everything's down. You log into the AWS console. This is, everybody's like, oh, we have to terraform everything we ever do. This is one of those scenarios you probably don't have to terraform this thing. You're going to do it one time and never touch it again for the rest of your life. So it's fine to do this from the console. Go into the console, click the CloudTrail thing, hit create trail, set the settings that you want, fill in your bucket, fill in your key, do that stuff, set your encryption stuff, and hit go. And you hit go and it's just done. If 4 months from now somebody adds a new account, the data will just magically show up in your centralized logging bucket. There's nothing else to do after it. This is the easiest part of this whole process, is turning this thing on. But once you've turned it on, so now you're done and you've turned it on, time starts to matter, because this is the point where you are absolutely being double billed for CloudTrail. You're being double billed for every storage. You're being double billed for everything. So you now have a time window where you want to get the other ones turned off if possible. And if you've done a good job communicating, everybody knows that they're being turned off today. It doesn't mean that their old log data goes away. It's sitting in that bucket, it will stay in that bucket probably till the end of time if they didn't put a lifecycle policy on it. But you want to get the actual CloudTrails themselves turned off at this point. But what's great is you collected an inventory of them all in the first scenario. I think you can use that inventory. You can script it. You can manually go turn them off. There's lots of ways to do this. What you will find is that, I think we use Terragrunt or something here for some of our stuff, and it puts some of these, things in as part of the standard Terraform it rolls out. They may have to go and comment some of that out, because that will notice that as drift, that went away. It will try to recreate it again. It will be denied by the SCP you put in place. And so you may get some errors in some of those automation scripts. Again, most of your teams will be aware of that as they go to do it, but it's just one of those things that could happen after the fact, after you start turning these things off and then locking people out of it. And then again, once it's done, notify the teams. Go check your logs, make sure your tools still work, make sure you're still getting data into Splunk, make sure you're getting data wherever it needs to go at these points. So hopefully this happens fairly quickly for you. Sometimes it takes a week. A week in billing probably won't be too bad for most people, but if you let it linger for months, you'll definitely you'll see the impact. So, anything else there to worry about, Christoph? I think we talked about most of it in the prep versus in the day you actually turn them off.
Yeah, if you did a good job up front, this should be a smoother process. You may still have a couple of snags, but at least you're not left with a massive surprise and something you weren't expecting at all. A common pitfall, in addition to what you just mentioned, is maybe you didn't get the permissions completely right, and so it's not all working as you expected. Maybe some of the data is not pulling in or showing up or whatever the scenario is, but at least you've, like you said, you've got some time. Yes, you're getting double billed, but you don't have to immediately turn it off right away. You have a little bit of time. You can make sure everything's working properly. And yeah, you might hit a couple snags though. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah. Planning is key, and again, you'll work through them fairly quickly once you're in that state. Old logs versus new logs. I have a tendency, and maybe I'm lazy, just to leave the old logs where they are. They're fine there. Put life cycles on those buckets, in 7 years when you need them to go away, make them go away. However, you may want to migrate them all to the new location. And so this is a bigger piece of work because, again, if you had a lot of CloudTrails across a lot of accounts, you're now going to move a bunch of data into this bucket where the new location is. What's nice is that the prefix, if you were using CloudTrail before, the prefixes are super predictable in what they are. You'll see this kind of example one where it's an org followed by an account number, followed by CloudTrail, followed by AP Northeast, followed by the year, followed by the month, followed by the day, and that's where all the files are. You can just take that structure and move it in because the new CloudTrail location, that S3 bucket, you will see has the exact same account ID in it and the same stuff. So you can kind of merge them right into the same bucket that they were there. But it's a process. If you got 1 billion files in one of those things, it's going to take some time to move them around. And so again, up to you. If you're dealing with short time frames for your life cycles, like these CloudTrails go away after 90 days, I'd let sleeping files be there and just let them ride out their 90 days. If this is a scenario where you were keeping them for 7 years for compliance reasons, it's probably worth the effort to move them into the existing new bucket. So I know, Christoph, your opinions on this one? Always move, never move?
I think it just really depends. Ideally, though, you've got somewhere where you can store them, and maybe that's not even in S3. Maybe that's somewhere remote. It just kind of depends on what your org is using for that. I was going to add something that's slightly unrelated, but I figured it would be important to point it out, which is that if you look under option 2, where you have the new and then you have that path, it's actually a good way to visualize what that's going to look like, because you have AWS logs / and then the org ID / the account ID and then everything after that. And so you can actually pinpoint that with scripts or with your bucket policies in order to access data for that particular account. And so if you've never set this up before, if you've never seen it, that's a good way to visualize how that's actually going to look like when it's stored in that the log archive S3 bucket, and what those prefixes are going to look like exactly.
Yeah, and it's exactly how you're going to give the teams access to their accounts data. You're going to write that bucket policy using that path, and that's how you lock them down so they can't see everybody else's logs. Maybe you don't care if they can see other people's logs, but if you do, that's how you're going to do it, is using that path in the bucket resource policy. So good stuff. This is the SCP for putting the deny in, so you don't get more CloudTrails later and extra costs. Again, I would absolutely set up some form of lifecycle policy on here to make sure that whatever your rules are, the stuff goes away. There's an SCP writing course there that you guys can grab as well. Just another webinar that has some great stuff on writing SCPs. There are huge varying opinions as to what is the cheapest way to archive CloudTrail data, and that would be another topic for another discussion as well, depending on the shape of your data and how it is. Sometimes Glacier is cheap, sometimes it's not. Sometimes different tiers are better, and sometimes, as Christoph says, better to move it just out of AWS and store it somewhere else because it's cheaper. So again, lots of ways to do that, but just figure out what that is when you're done that. So Christoph, any kind of closing remarks? I know that we've got some documentation here in the resources file, and we're going to open this for Q&A. We're kind of over time. Sorry it took us a little longer, But most important, there's a QR code here. This will get you access to your free month of those cyber courses, which are amazing. The cloud permissions learning course is really good. It has some great data in it. And then if you really want to get into the details of stuff, I think, Christoph, you said there's an AWS certification specialty course in there as well. So just some great data for everyone.
Exactly. And so even if you're not interested in getting that certification yet, I'd still recommend going through the first few sections of it, because we walk through almost exactly what we just walked through today, but in the implementation side of things. So going through and actually clicking around the console, how do you set up organizations? How do you set up SCPs, RCPs? How do you then set up the org-wide trail, or the org-wide trail in CloudTrail? And then how do you set that up in the log archive account? Then how do you set up the security tooling account? How do you use something like CloudTrail Lake if you're using that in order to access that new trail? Because the way that some of these services I think it's how AWS rolled out AWS Organizations and then tried to make some of the services work with it, is not always super, super smooth. They're improving it over time. So hopefully this process will change a bit over the next year or two. But if you are using CloudTrail Lake and or Athena, and you need to be able to ingest that data for incident response or other types of analysis, that integration is going to break as you move to the org-wide trail. And so I show you how to go through and prevent that from breaking, and what permission issues you need to think about, how to use delegated administration, which Sandy mentioned at the beginning of this presentation here. So there's a lot of considerations that we touched on here today, but hearing it and then actually seeing it are two entirely different things. And so I would definitely recommend going through that, even if you're not interested in the certification just yet, just so you can see how to do it in practice and beyond just the theory. But yeah, hopefully this was a good starting point, and some good tips from the field of how to deploy this without blowing everything up in the process of it.
Sounds good. James, hopefully you've been following along here. I'm not sure if there are any questions in the Q&A, or if
yeah. Well, obviously, yeah. First off, thank you both. Just really dense 45 minutes there of information. So hopefully everybody could absorb that, and it's just super, super useful. And one thing I'd love for everybody to do, please submit your questions, even if we don't have time to get to them. There are some questions that are around like, hey, how many org units should I have, and things about org structure. And that is the topic really of our next session, right? Is structuring and the hierarchy itself of OUs and organizations. So if you have ideas for, this is great, I'd love to hit this next, please also give us that in the chat as well as we go beyond audit. So please put that in now if you have any. And then on the next slide, just as a reminder, is Sunry, if you want to check us out, we talked a little bit about SCPs today, but not a ton. We have something called the Cloud Permissions Firewall that has essentially automated the use of SCPs and RCPs for you towards the end of sort of eliminating excess privileges and things like unused identities and putting an off button on for unused services and regions, and a lot of other cool stuff. So we do offer a free trial. That's on the next slide if you want to check it out. All that functionality is in there for you, in addition to your free month of cyber. So thank you. Thanks everybody for checking that out. Yeah, any other questions here? Let's see. We've got what's your top priority when refactoring orgs? I think the answer is making sure you don't have audit gaps and not double paying. I think that's basically what we covered today, right, guys? And it seems like we can get into there's that other topic you can get into of how to cheaply store the old logs and things like that. It sounds like that might be a rabbit hole. But is there anything else on sort of the FinOps side as far as cost and making sure you're minimizing while you're doing the switch over? Any pointers that you want to give people around sort of the consumption and making sure you're not double billing?
I'll start with an easy one, but an often overlooked one, and I think you'll agree, Sandy. We talked about this I think a couple weeks ago, but the difficulty in getting tagging right. And so If you, especially if you take the AWS console route or the script route, for deploying this stuff, don't forget the tags. I think it's easier to not forget the tags if you're in Terraform or IAC in general. But the moment you go into the console, you're like, screw it, I don't need these tags. Just next, next, next.
Yeah.
And so, that would be my top one. That's just so easy, but yet so often overlooked. Have some really good tagging in place, and follow a similar structure, and have that deployed throughout the entire organization. It's going to help a lot when it comes to exploring your costs and why you're getting billed for stuff. Definitely.
It's a good point. I think we should add that as part 5 to this thing, James, tagging policies to set up, and see if we want to talk about break stuff. We'll put some tagging policies in, and then we'll really break stuff. But enforcement of that stuff is super. If you can get it to the point that you can write tagging policies, it's phenomenal. I think it's perfect. All right.
Cool. Well, yeah, just to address another question we had, will you be at Reinforce? So Christoph, unfortunately, will not be there. Sunry will be there, as Matt answered. We're going to be at booth 616. Christoph will be at Forward CloudSec in Denver. We'll also be there. So if you're in Philadelphia for Reinforce next week or in 2 weeks, or if you're in Forward CloudSec at the end of the month, please stop by and see Christoph or us at Sunry. So thanks for that. All right, that's pretty much it. Christoph, thank you so much. Sandy, thanks again.
Thank you.
James.
Yeah, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks. See ya.
Have a good one.